Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about Carleton Stearns. I'm going to call him Sergeant Carleton Stearns because that was his rank that he worked his way up to through his career. And of course, you're going to talk about his twin brother Fred in a little while. But this is about the First World War, the war to end all wars. And Sergeant Carleton Stearns started out as a private. And we are very lucky because he kept a detailed diary. Every day had an entry. And so then, and Ruth, you may not remember this, but Ruth Beard, who's here today, typed his entire diary up for him on a typewriter, manual typewriter. And we now have it in about 90 pages of the original typewriter that Ruth typed in for us all. So we thank you because all of his diaries are now kept in perpetuity. But I'm going to do those start at the place where he enlists in World War I and take us through his experience. There's lots of interesting dates that we're going to touch on. Grampy was a very religious person, and you'll see why there's some significant dates in his history. First, he enlisted in the Army Medical Corps so he could avoid getting drafted. At that point, the draft had been instituted, and everybody was about to get drafted, and he wanted to control his destiny. So he chose to enlist in the Army Medical Corps. He felt comfortable with the Medical Corps because his father had been a pharmacist, and he was comfortable with that end of the business. So he headed down to Long Island. He took a boat to Long Island. He reported in Boston, took a boat down to Long Island, and that was on December 7th, 1917. So quite a few years, but a significant date nonetheless. He went to Camp Mills, which is located just outside New York City, did his medical training, living in a tent, commuting into places like Bellevue Hospital, places like that, where they gave them medical training. And he was a private when he was there. Lived a very social couple of months there. A lot of his entries are out to dinner with Sophie, Sophie this, Sophie that. Visited Allen's there, visited Briggs there. A lot of Briggs and Allen names, Carl Allen mentioned a few times. So they lived outside New York City, and he visited them. His first paycheck, if you're interested, was $50 a month. And of course, Grampy, very monetarily interested, all of his money is mentioned in this log throughout it. So we get to know how much he spent on dinner, how much it cost, how much they tipped the waiter in francs, and so forth. So it's kind of entertaining. He mentions churches a lot. And he goes to churches and talks about how wonderful they are and describes them in his notes. So he boarded a ship to go to the war on Palm Sunday, 1918. So Palm Sunday. So again, another significantly religious day for him. And he heads out on a boat where he's headed off to Liverpool. The ship is named Mauritania. So it was a luxury liner that they converted into a troop carrier. And there were 8,000 troops on that ship that day heading over to England. Rough seas, but Grampy, at the time Private Stearns, didn't get seasick. He watched others have their difficulty and lose their dinner, but not him. Like my father, he slept in a hammock all the way over, along with his 7,999 buddies. They celebrated Easter at sea, April 2nd, 1918. Once they landed in Liverpool, they took the train and marched their way down to the English Channel, where they took a boat across to France and arrived in Le Havre, France on April 5th, 1918. Well, then they took trains and worked their way down to Mahon, I guess it's pronounced Mahon. I should have Vic look at this. He's my French translator here, but it's Mahon, France, which is just south, if you can imagine, just south east of Paris. If you look at the map I handed out, you will see where I put a mark. The top box shows you to the red line. If you follow the red line, you will see that that's where Grampy Stearns, Carleton Stearns is located. He will spend his entire career in the First World War at one hospital in that location. So if you want to picture it on the map, that's where he was located. So that's where he headed on his train ride and got there. And during the first few months, this is now April, they spent almost 2 months setting up a hospital with no patients yet, but outfitting this building with medical equipment, beds, cots. He was in the part of the carpentry unit, and they had to build a lot. He talks about that, or writes about that in there. one of the things that they had to do is they had to plant a garden. And he was hoping they would select him as the head gardener. And I never see anywhere else in the notes that they ever did. So I don't think he became the head gardener, but he wanted to be. But one of the things I found in researching World War I is I found out something very interesting. When Grampy Stearns was back here teaching agriculture, working at the Topsfield Fair, what was the one vegetable / fruit that he was an expert on? Does anybody know? Tomatoes. Well, he got that, I now am convinced, because of his time working in the French gardens. Because there was an advertisement when they were trying to get troops to go to France. It was always, bring troops, tomatoes. A big shortage of tomatoes in France, and they were planting tomatoes in a lot of these gardens. So my guess is that he probably gained a lot of his tomato experience, because he later wrote a lot about tomatoes, probably right over there in the gardens there. His paycheck in May 1918 had been converted to francs. So his check was 84 francs, and yes, I did the research. And now we know why soldiers talked about giving pay cuts to go to war. Because when converted over into dollars, that was only $17. So he got a pay cut from $50 to $17 when he went to France. Although supposedly francs bought a lot over there, so maybe he got a little more bang for the buck. The first patient started to arrive on June 2nd, 1918. He writes about the first patients coming in, and he wrote a lot about how their condition got worse and worse as weeks went by. The number one injury at that point was mustard gas injury, the treatment for that, and how did they fix the wounds for that. His role there, he was a corpsman, so he was like, if you watch MASH, he was like Klinger. You know, he did a little of everything, helped the nurses, helped the doctors, and spent long hours putting bandages on wounded soldiers and redressing the wounds. That was how he spent most of his time. Some of those days, 15, 18 hours a day, just treating wounds for the most part when it got really heavy there near the end. He writes about how fast the hospital and his ward expanded with patients. And one statistic to follow on Don's statistics, by the end of the war he wrote down that hospital had served 12,440 patients and only 151 had died. So that's a very low mortality rate when you think about wartime today. That's a very low statistic. He told an amusing story about a nurse in his ward who was dating, I guess, or in love with a pilot. And the pilot would fly over the place and drop love letters on top of the compound. He wrote a note about that, which was kind of cute. Red Sox fans. Any Red Sox fans here? Well, Grampy Stearns won a pound of fudge and 10 francs when the Boston Red Sox defeated the White Sox in the World Series in 1918. That was the last time they won the World Series in his lifetime. I thought that was kind of amusing. Now, in November 2nd, 1918, and you'll see this is significant, he heads out with two friends, Chrisman and Bosford, over to St. Malo via Dinard. And if you look way over here on the coast, on the west coast of the map, you'll see I drew this blue line over to this port right here. And this is where he was partying. He had 2 weeks off, furlough, and he was partying there when he found out the war was over. And he writes about drinking champagne, tipping the waiters 40 francs, and having a wild time over on the coast right there. Again, another ladies' man. He's playing tennis with French girls. He's writing about that, never names them, which I thought was interesting. There's really no names over there.
Does it mention his engagement?
No, none of that's mentioned anywhere, and I've double-checked everywhere. So I don't know if that was something you picked up over the years. There's no mention of any engagement. Well, that wasn't mentioned in any of his notes. In fact, there's no girls' names mentioned anywhere in the notes. Just French girls, French mademoiselles. So eventually he works his way back to his compound. Now this is only November 1918. The war is now over. But they're still there, and they're working on taking the hospital apart, treating the wounded soldiers that are still there. And one of the things that, where's my note here? On Christmas Day, 1918, he was promoted to sergeant, which was his final rank. Vic, could you pass me that yellow folder over there? I wanted to read you something. During late winter, early spring, he wrote often, thank you, Vic, he wrote often about how he missed his brother, and that he knew his brother was just a few hours away from him in serving in France at the time. And he always wondered if he was well, and he didn't hear very often. And so he knew where he was. And on the map, you'll see where I've marked where Fred spent most of his career there in France, which is, if you'll see, is just in that pink box. I will draw the line over towards Bourges, which is a city not far from where he was, but it was back then. It wasn't easy to get there. And he finally connected with him. He had a couple days off, rode in the train overnight, and then he wrote this. I'm going to read exactly. Rough train ride overnight, and I signed in the office, because whenever a military person traveled around there, you had to sign in with the local office. And he went to the ordnance camp. Sam, you mentioned your great-grandfather was in the ordnance unit. And then he hiked 3 miles, and he found Fred's quarters. And he waited for him to come home from work. What a surprised boy he was to see me standing at his barracks door, and mighty glad we were to see each other after a lapse of 18 months. Had dinner with Fred at the mess hall. After dinner, he was transferred from one unit to the other unit, which means that he will leave for the States in 2 weeks. Gee, wouldn't it be great to go back at the same time, on the same ship? About 4 o'clock, we left camp for Mahon, where we had a fine steak dinner, French fries, and so forth. Gives the whole menu they ate. Fred was able to get a pass for overnight, so we got a room at the Hotel Charles VII for the night. These French people know how to sleep comfortably. We retired about 8:30 onto a big feather bed, and for over an hour, we just lay there in comfort and just talked of things and happenings since we have been separated from each other. Well, it sure was good to see and to talk with Fred. Really a dream come true. On Sunday, we got up at 10 after a good night's sleep, and then we went over to the Knights of Columbus hut and wrote a letter home to the folks. Had dinner at Charles Hotel, which was only fair. At this hotel, Joan of Arc visited in the 15th century. After dinner, we walked up the canal to the camp, spent the rest of the day just talking. Had supper with Fred and left him at 8 p.m., wishing him bon voyage. In the near future, we would see each other again. We both hoped to be home by April 1st. I returned back to the hotel, where I had a good night's sleep, and then got the 9 o'clock train back to my location. So I think it's just wonderful that he wrote those notes, so we can actually kind of picture what he was doing at that moment. I'll shorten it up and say that he spent the next months there working on taking the hospital apart. He got his orders home, and amazingly, he headed over to the port. You see on the map, I wrote the port over to the far west side where Grampy was going to head out. And he got the orders in mid-March 1919, and he left camp and went with troops over to the port. It took them a whole month of red tape to actually be able to board the ship, which was, for him, the U.S. Finland hospital ship, where he was to command as a sergeant orderlies and take care of 900 wounded soldiers on the trip home. And that was his role on the trip home. And then he tells about going home to Melrose. He then writes later that a number of years later, 1942, so both of you were young at that time, he had a reunion of types with Earl Chrisman and some others at the Coconut Grove Hotel in Boston a few days before it burned to the ground. So he talks about, had it been few days later, that he might have been in that fire. So I thought that was an interesting piece of trivia. And as I wrap up his story, just to let everybody know that during the Second World War, because of his agricultural background, he actually hosted a radio show on how to build a victory garden. So people could tune in over the airwaves, and Grampy would talk about building victory gardens, and he'd put one in his backyard. So that's Carl's story.
Who was the older brother?
Carleton was the older brother, Fred was the younger brother by just a few hours.
When he did the radio program, would he have been at Essex Aggie?
He was at Essex Aggie.
Yes.
Yep, and he did some shows at WRKO in Boston and some on a local station in the Danvers
So
area.
the ESX.
Steve, when did he get his master's degree? Do you know?
He got his master's degree,
While I was a little girl.
yeah, it was in the 40s, maybe 30s.
Okay. Where did he
Don,
get?
you were, Don had a
You know when he retired from Essex?
No, Boston.
I haven't read that far ahead. I
Roughly,
would-
roughly a year, because I
Mom,
used
do you
to,
know when he retired from Essex?
because as a youngster, I was in 4-H, and I exhibited my vegetables at the Topsfield Fair.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they were always judged, and I'm sure.
Tomato, he was a tomato judge for 60
I knew he was
years.
a judge, but I mean, I didn't know at that time, but. he
In
might
fact,
have-
Patty and I took the kids there when he was still a judge, so it was that recent.
There's a great picture of him judging tomatoes, and he's in his 90s.
Yeah.
We have an article on that.
Yes.
A newspaper article.
Yeah.
Yeah, Westminster.
Where did he get his master's degree
No.
and in what?